This episode is sponsored by Grow Therapy. Grow Therapy was founded on the belief that quality mental health care should be accessible. It makes finding an in-network therapist easy. Go to growtherapy.com to find your match and let insurance pay for your therapy.
Welcome to a place where you'll leave feeling whole. The Counseling Podcast brings at-home counseling right to you, focusing on self-care, self-expression, and breaking down barriers. Dr. Jacqueline and Dr. Stokes bring over 20 years of combined experience and a new sense of style to the word counseling. The two use humor and lighthearted conversation to explore these deeper feelings. Let's take the stigma away from counseling together.
Hello, listeners. Welcome to the very first episode of our podcast. We are here to bring the counseling right to you. For those of you who don't know us, I am Dr. Jacqueline. I like to think of myself as a modern counselor, and to me, that just means I do not place each person in a box. I use multiple approaches in session and really individualize the treatment I provide. My style is person-centered, meaning that you get to guide the conversation and be free to communicate your needs in a relaxed environment. You are allowed to express yourself in an open and non-judgmental space.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dr. Jeremiah Stokes. I'm a licensed mental health counselor here in Orlando, Florida. I'm also a faculty member at Concordia University, the Irvine campus, and I'm a supporting faculty member at Rollins College. I am what we would call an integrative therapist, so I use a couple different modalities, including existential approaches, as well as psychodynamic and person-centered approaches. To me, one of the most important missions I have as a modern-day therapist is to help educate people on mental health and to help destigmatize mental illness and psychological issues. Welcome to the podcast.
So we know that there is a stigma surrounding counseling, and we want to take that away and show you that this is something that is becoming more popular. So we know that counseling can be cool and something that is more of a self-care moment of expressing yourself.
Absolutely. I think that that's the most important thing for us to inform our listeners on is that one of our missions is to help everyone here understand that mental health is something that is cool and it's a good thing, right? And I think that counseling and therapy, those two terms are interchangeable for the listeners in case you didn't know that. That's something that helps to facilitate higher levels of mental health. So what we want to do is we want to be able to help inform you of this wonderful thing called counseling, but then also help to kind of educate you on some additional principles and practices to help foster mental health. And I know, Dr. Jacqueline, I know one of your missions is to really, kind of make counseling this real practical modern day thing that people are utilizing in their lives.
Yes, exactly. So we want to bring a new sense of style to the term counseling. We know there will be very serious moments, and we treat those with the most appropriate methods and provide each person with the respect they deserve. And with that, we also use humor and lighthearted conversation to explore the tough issues. So we feel this really helps you to break down the barrier or resistance to the counseling session, and feel free to openly express yourself. So who doesn't want to talk about themselves for an hour venting and having someone validate them? We want this to be a great experience for you guys.
Absolutely. I mean, I love talking about myself for an hour. Any opportunity that I have to do that, I take. And, I love the fact that you mentioned that, even though counseling can be this really serious thing, it can be a very fun process and experience. And it can be very lighthearted. You mentioned the idea of humor. And I know that you and I have talked about that in previous conversations about how, we will utilize things like humor and lightheartedness in our sessions. Because, I think the most important thing for us to understand is that counseling is a relationship. It's a professional relationship where the licensed mental health professional works alongside the client or the patient, depending on the particular setting. And it kind of helps them address and identify the areas of their life that they want to improve. And so, what for you, Dr. Jacqueline, what's important for you for people to understand about mental health in general? What are some of the important things for you in that area?
I think it's important for them to know that this is a space where they can come and really vent those issues, that they don't get to have that outlet for them in everyday interactions. And this is a place where they can come. It's not so stiff. Let me come for the hour. Let me talk about this. Let me break down these barriers. Let me gain some insight into what's going on and how to cope and overcome these issues.
Yeah, I think that's a great working definition as just this safe space that we provide. I had a new client come in this week who had a lot of reservations about therapy in general, and I'll change some demographic information here. But he didn't really know what to expect about therapy. He didn't, all he knew was what he saw on TV, and you and I know that the media sometimes can portray aspects of therapy accurately, but sometimes it's quite inaccurate. And he didn't know what to expect. And I think that I was able to facilitate that working definition that you just gave, that, hey, this is a place where you can come in and relax and kick back and just sort of process whatever's going on in your life. And, you mentioned coping skills, and I think that's also a really important area. And I look at our world right now, Dr. Jacqueline, and I see all the people struggling with all of the things that are going on globally and in our nation specifically. And when you mention coping skills, it makes me really think about how much, I think myself included, how much we really need that right now.
Exactly. And it's not even just the individual who deals with the stigma, but it's their family and the pressure. I've had a lot of clients as well of, my family doesn't approve or they don't understand. And so for them to have that insight of why people come to us, what they get from that really, I think, helps them to understand, okay, this doesn't mean that I'm in this box of I am this way, or that mental labeling that we've talked about. It doesn't mean that something is wrong with you or should be frowned upon. It is, I'm doing this to better myself, just like we do when we eat healthier, or we work out, or we go to the doctor. Like, this is a place where people that's the same thing. I want to learn more about my emotional responses and my thoughts.
Absolutely. And I love that. And I think really what I'm hearing too is this advocacy piece and this empowerment piece that we're also able to provide as therapists for people. Because we know how challenging life can be. And you mentioned family relationships and family not understanding some of the things that we're going through. I think a lot of people feel really disempowered right now. And so I think that's one of the perks and benefits of therapy, is that we're able to use this platform as a way to advocate for our clients and help them feel this new sense of self-empowerment. And a lot of times I don't think clients really even realize or expect that being the benefit of therapy, but it usually, if the client does the work and if the therapist is doing the job, usually that can be something that happens in the process.
Yes, I think exactly. I think some thoughts about counseling, maybe, this isn't for me, or this won't work, or they won't understand me. And you shouldn't be afraid to ask to your counselor, what is your counseling style? A good therapist will want to share that information, want to make sure they fit your needs. And if you are considering counseling, if someone's out there, they can ask themselves, like, what are my expectations? What do I want from counseling? How does this help me? And how will I go about starting the process into counseling? So just being mindful of what your expectations and needs are, and how you can fit that into your style, and how your therapist will fit that in for you.
I think those are such important points. And it makes me think too, like, just the fit, just finding the right fit. I know that years ago when I went to find a therapist myself, and before I got into the field, there was some trial and error. I had to really look around, and I had to have a couple, sessions with some folks that just weren't good matches for me. And I think that to add to that, I think that people need to be open to that. It's just like any professional relationship. Sometimes you're not going to mesh well with your doctor. Sometimes, if you have to get an attorney, maybe it's not a good fit. And I think therapists it's really important that your therapist is a good fit, because, you're discussing some of the most intimate details of your life. But I think those are really important points. So I was wondering, Dr. Jacqueline, for our listeners, if we could kind of use some of our talk today to help destigmatize not just mental illness, because I think a lot of people, they hear the term mental illness, the quote unquote, the normal person, the everyday person hears the term mental illness, and it's like, oh, that's not me. I don't have a mental illness. Mm-hmm. That may be the case, but what about just the problems of life, the difficulties in your relationships, some of the stress issues that you're having, maybe some of that sadness, maybe your energy levels aren't as good as they used to be. You're feeling a little fatigued. Maybe you're, sort of racing thoughts, or anger, or, impulsive, and the list goes on and on and on. These are all part of the human condition. So I'm wondering, Dr. Jacqueline, today, if we can kind of spearhead that for our listeners, is help them understand that, like, hey, if you're a human, you have problems, right?
Exactly. And so every day is of being mindful or just replacing negative thoughts and with everything that you're doing. A lot of my clients, we use like CBT and how to stay mindful of, okay, let me replace these self-doubts with positive affirmations, or just to, practice that every day to know that going into this, these are normal things that everyone deals with, but how am I going to change that for myself? And it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with me. It means that, it's just realistic everyday stressors that happen to everyone. And it's just how you deal with it and how you kind of have that inner thought with yourself and your behaviors around that.
Absolutely. I think that's such an important piece, is like first having that awareness. You mentioned mindfulness, and having that awareness that, hey, like I'm a human and life is really hard even in the best of circumstances, life can be hard, but having that awareness of like, wait, what's the language internally? What's that internal narrative that I'm using about myself or about the world? And then you also mentioned the behaviors. And for our listeners who don't know, Dr. Jacqueline mentioned CBT, which stands for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, which is the most evidence-based therapy out there. And basically it just looks at how a person can learn to change their thoughts and change that inner dialogue, as well as modifying some of those behaviors. And so that's usually an area that many therapists will target if a person comes in with difficulties, right? Difficulties, okay, well, let's look at your thoughts. How are you thinking about things? How are you perceiving things? And then let's look at your behaviors. I mean, as therapists, if we can work on changing those two things for people, as helping people change those within themselves, as it relates to their problems, they can really start off quite well and start making some relatively good headway.
Of course. And Dr. Stokes, I love how you also want to normalize of like those everyday feelings and emotions. It's like, and I know we're going to talk about this in future podcasts of us being parents and all of that. But even with my 10-year-old son, letting him know that it's okay to get angry. It's okay to cry. It's okay to have these emotions. But how do we want to deal with it? And how do we want to talk to ourselves in those moments? Like, it's okay not to punish ourselves for having feelings. We're all human.
Absolutely. And there's that compassion that many of us as parents have for our children, but yet, and Dr. Jacqueline, I know you can attest to this, our clients and even ourselves, we don't have that for ourselves, right? And so I think that's another mission of ours, right? When you and I started to create this idea for this podcast, is we want people to learn how to have compassion for themselves. We certainly want you to be accountable to yourself and make changes, but also there needs to be this doorway by way of compassion where you start to treat yourself differently, right? I think that's such a big thing for clients, and oftentimes can be the root of a lot of our problems.
Of course. And I see a lot of clients that hold themselves with all this pressure of, I have to be a certain way. I'm not being good enough if I react this way, or what's wrong with me, or putting so much pressure and burden on themselves to be a certain way. And if they're not meeting that standard expectation, they have a hard time with that. And that's where maybe the anxiety comes from, and the worry and fear that I'm not being what I should be, when really forgive yourself and let yourself off the hook for those moments,
Absolutely. There's so much pressure. And I still haven't figured out why we're so hard on ourselves, about so many different things in life. And there's that default for many of us, that internal pressure, and just these really, I think, really high expectations. And when we don't meet those, we feel really bad. And obviously some of us are raised in environments where, that's kind of the culture of our families, that, sort of let's break you down to build you up, that kind of mentality. And the world, I think, expects a lot out of us. I mean, people are working way more on average. Their companies are expecting more out of them. Their jobs are expecting more. So I think that, folks are coming into therapy with just an enormous amount of pressure from life. And that's one of the things that we want to help you as a listener. Maybe we can give you some techniques and some skills to help sort of unplug a little bit and decompress a little bit.
No, that's great. And I know that we've talked about, even opening up about our own vulnerabilities within the podcast to share the human side of us. And I think, today a lot, because of social media, people compare, or, I have to be a certain way, or getting feedback from others. And it's very stressful, I would think, to want to hold yourself at this, this image.
That has so much to do with that, right? This idea of society creating this through social media, this expectation of who we need to be, how we need to look, how we need to raise our families even. I mean, if you go on social media and it's like there's messages, there's some overt and some subtle that are just starting to affect the hardwiring or have affected the hardwiring neurologically of people for a really long time. And, maybe that's another area that we can help people with is, hey, let's go in and kind of let's unpack some of that stuff and sort of maybe create some hardwiring that you want for your life in terms of how you see yourself.
No, I think that's fantastic. And I feel that that's very important for us to share that with.
Absolutely. So let's destigmatize this whole mental illness thing. And so for the listeners, as mental health professionals, many of us will use diagnoses to help label clients. And Dr. Jacqueline and I, our styles, we don't necessarily rely on that heavily, although that is important in our profession because it's diagnosis for mental illness is a language that we all use to communicate. But again, as I mentioned earlier, I want to encourage everyone in listening to really think about your life and think about what are the problems and the stressors that I face on a daily basis. And I think it's important to note that some of those can be internal, so they can be thoughts and feelings, but then some can be external. Like you could be in a really toxic relationship, or you could be dealing with a really arrogant boss at work, and there's a million scenarios. But what are your thoughts on that, Dr. Jacqueline? Is us maybe starting to kind of help people become informed about what exactly the problem is?
I love that you bring that up, because that's a lot of stuff I work with my clients as well, the internal and external obstacles that the internal of fighting with ourselves of I'm not doing enough, or these thoughts, and then the external. So I like that, to bring that awareness to people to help them be more mindful and figure that out for themselves through this process. Because the more information you bring to the therapy session, that helps your counselor be able to guide you to the goal that you want to achieve.
Absolutely. And I think some clients, Dr. Jacqueline, struggle with a couple things. They struggle with the insight. They sometimes folks in we're not faulting people for this. This is life, but sometimes people don't even know really what the problem is, right? But I think that them being able to kind of look within and have this awareness, as you're mentioning, Dr. Jacqueline, and to be able to bring that into the therapy, that's so informative for the therapist, because that can kind of give them a framework. And quite frankly, your therapist is going to have their own perception of things too. It's a shared collaboration, right? They see your problems through the lens of how you see your problems, but they're also professionally trained to see problems and see barriers, and as you mentioned, obstacles from their own professional lens as well. But being able to do that, being able to identify within yourself, hey, what are the things that are even problematic? And I think that's probably the first step. And by doing that, though, recognizing that just because you have problems doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. And you were mentioning something about labeling earlier, Dr. Jacqueline?
Just the mental labeling of what maybe society places on you, and when you share what you're going through, people then define or label of, well, that means that is you. Well, no, I am me, and I am dealing with something that I can overcome. It doesn't mean that this is defining me. And that's what I think people get scared about of, well, if I tell them that I'm dealing with this and going to a therapist, they're going to see me as this. Well, let's drop that label. Let's just say that you are you, and we have something that we're going to work on. We're going to overcome this.
That's a critical piece. And that reminds me of what we talk about in narrative therapy. We call it externalizing the symptom. And that's the idea that I am not my problems, right? My problems, my issues, my obstacles, my deficits, they are part of my life. But those, as you mentioned, those are not the things that define me. And I absolutely, people have to really recognize that, whatever the problem is, it could be something really pervasive, like an addiction. It could be, it could be stress. It could be anything. But being able to have that moment with yourself where you realize, yes, this is something that I have to take responsibility for, and I have to change, because that's a big part of mental health, is that we have to work at this thing. But also, this does not define me as a person.
Exactly.
I think that's so important.
And I think we had a really good discussion about this, saying a good start. And I think our discussions can definitely continue on to talk about that and bring that awareness to everyone. And with that being said, we want to thank all of you for listening and for your time being present with us today. And definitely be on the lookout for more episodes. And we will continue our discussions with topics like stigma surrounding mental health, mental labeling, wellness approach, common issues everyday people face. And then we'll also dive into our roles as parenting coordinators and welcoming guests to speak about their perspective on the counseling journey. And we just want you guys to remember that counseling is for you to be mindful of your goals and to strive to get there and ask yourself what you want out of this journey.
Absolutely. And I just want to thank the listeners for tuning in. And I'm extremely excited about continuing this conversation with Dr. Jacqueline. It's a passion of mine to educate the community on mental health and well-being. So it's been a pleasure.
And thank you so much, Dr. Stokes, in discussing this with me. And this podcast was just the beginning, and we definitely look forward to spending more time with you guys. And until next time, have a wonderful day.
We'll see you next time.
Thank you so much for joining us here today on the Counseling Podcast with Dr. Jacqueline and Dr. Stokes. Please take this time to thank yourself for putting in the work. If this episode impacted you in any way, let us know with a loving and honest review. If you have any questions or want to continue the conversation from today, you can reach out to us at thecounselingpodcast@gmail.com, and we can answer your questions right here on the show. Or you can find Dr. Jacqueline and Dr. Stokes on Instagram at DocJacqueline and at dr.jeremiah.stokes.